All right. Good afternoon, everyone. In case you haven't met me before, I'm Matt, the education manager here. I'm filling in for Keenan. He has a sick pupper today. But welcome to another Senior Wednesday. Next month's speaker will be Dr. David DeVries, Associate Professor of History at Kansas State University. A talk titled The Vikings in the Global Middle Ages. In the past 2 decades, scholars have been reassessing the popular image of the Christian today. Some technical difficulties with the stream.
Can you turn off the YouTube there that I have up there? It's playing.
Yes, that's what it is. Yes.
Okay, it's gonna load.
Yeah. Where's my? Okay.
Just hit Alt F4, you'll get it.
Yeah, that's probably this one. There we go. All right. So, as I was saying, in the past 2 decades, scholars have been reassessing the popular image of the Middle Ages in Western Europe. Far from being a dark age, as many Enlightenment intellectuals scornfully dismissed the period, the Middle Ages was a dynamic period and much more sophisticated than popular culture would have us believe. In particular, advances in archaeology and paleogenetics has shed new light on the activities of Norse seafarers, often known as Vikings. We can now trace their journeys from Baghdad to Newfoundland. This talk will discuss the new image of Western Europe emerging calendars for November. But today, we're Professor Robert Schwaller from the University of Kansas, Latin America, and the historical experiences of Africa. Book Géneros de Gente in Early Colonial Mexico, Defining Racial Difference, explores the intellectual and social development of racial labels in early colonial Mexico. His current project, tentatively entitled Maroon Conquests, examines the earliest instances of marronage, or slave flight, in Hispaniola, Panama, and Mexico. He teaches courses focused on the history of Latin America and the Caribbean, specifically the colonial period and the issues of race. He is currently on KU's Executive Committee of the Latin America Area Studies Program, and in 2012 he was recognized by the Center for Teaching Excellence as a Celebration of Teaching Honoree. Having lived many years in and around Latin America, he enjoys introducing students to the varied peoples and cultures of the region. Please welcome Professor Schwaller.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here, and I've been to Wichita many times, but I haven't been to the museum, and so now I have to come back with my kids because there's all sorts of stuff here that they would very much want to see. So we'll get my PowerPoint back up. There we go.
We're good now.
So I'm just going to jump in. What I'm talking about here today is the experiences of some of the first Africans who were brought to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade, and the way that they resisted their enslavement. So a couple words that come up again and again, the word maroon. In English, we often think about that as being associated with like sailors, right, getting left on an island. That's actually like a later evolution of the word. The first meaning of the word is precisely what I'm talking about today. It means people that have fled. Originally it was indigenous people that were fleeing the Spanish, and then it became applied to enslaved Africans that were fleeing slavery. So it's this act of fleeing captivity or enslavement. I'm looking at this happening in Panama. Now, the broader project that I'm working on is looking at this in a bunch of different places. I've written about it, I've actually written about it for all of them, but for Mexico, for Hispaniola, which is where the Dominican Republic and Haiti are today, and for Panama. So I'm going to jump in kind of with the end of the story, which is like the successful part. And so the beginning of the end of the story starts in 1579 when a group of these African Maroons who had fled. So here we are in Panama. Oh, wrong way. Here we are in Panama. The group that I'm talking about right this minute was over here in the kind of forests along the coast of Panama. And they've been they've been independent, they've built their own community, and they've been fighting a war against the Spanish kind of very actively for about 5 years, but indirectly or kind of on and off for decades. And because of that, they actually sort of, the war becomes so costly to the Spanish that the Spanish are willing to negotiate. And so in 1579, a group of these Maroons are able to negotiate with the Spanish. The Spanish promise to give them their freedom, so they recognize them as free peoples. They're not going to send them back to their slave owners. And they let them found their own town that they get to govern themselves. And so the town of Santiago del Principe is the first free black town in the Americas, recognized by a European power, right? Obviously, African Maroons, they had a free town. They just weren't recognized by a European power. So this is the first sort of African-governed, organized town that Europeans sort of accept in all of the Atlantic. And we know that these are two old maps that are associated with the English, sometimes pirates, sometimes privateers, sometimes explorer, Francis Drake, who will come into the story in a little bit. But this is the town of Nombre de Dios, which was the port that the Spanish had in Panama. And this is kind of a picture of it. And you can't quite see where this town that the Maroons founded is. It's a little bit off to the side. Like if this picture was like another 2 or 3 inches this way, it would kind of be up over here. So how did this come to be? How did we get to this point? And so for that, I'm now going to jump way back. And actually, I realized I was walking around the museum. There are some artifacts of the indigenous peoples of Panama and also of kind of northern Colombia downstairs that apply to what I'm about to talk about right now. So the story, I start my history with the Spanish conquest of the region. Because one of the things that happens, and Panama is somewhat infamous when we talk about the Spanish conquest. Here, I'll move over to this side so you guys can see a bit of the screen. Because many of you have heard figures, or might have heard figures, that Spaniards, the indigenous population of the Americas, declines by like 90% over the course of the first century of European presence. That's true everywhere you go. But someplace like Mexico, which is where I've also done research, even with that decline, indigenous people still are the largest group of people in colonial society. They still outnumber all of the Spaniards that ever come, all of the African peoples that come, all the way until the national period. Panama's different. In Panama, we see a process of conquest that is absolutely brutal. And even Spaniard observers, so people writing at the time, talk about how bad and how brutal the conquest is. So what you can see here these are some maps that I drew for telling this story. The Spanish first arrive over here, and it's actually a group of Spaniards that they're actually running away. They really wanted to conquer over here in what is now Colombia, but they get fended off. The indigenous resistance is too strong. They have to run away. They cross this spit of water here called the Gulf of Uraba, and they target an indigenous community down here called Darien. And then within a few years, they're bolstered by a very large number of arrivals. The early kind of Spanish group is only a couple hundred, but in 1514, over 1,500 Spaniards come. And so what you see here are the maps, the routes that those Spanish conquest expeditions took to conquer the region. And a lot of what they're doing is trying to enslave Native Americans. This is at a period that's still very early on, and that is legal. Eventually it gets outlawed by the king. And they're bringing them back to this town, often to work in placer gold mines, to get gold. Being sold as captives back to the island of Hispaniola, which is the first island that the Spanish colonized. What that means is that over the course of about 7-8 years, the Isthmus of Panama from here where they start to here, Panama City, which is founded in 1519, is sort of systematically depopulated between warfare, between disease, between famine, between captivity. The Cueva people of the eastern part of Panama go from being about 250,000 at the start of this period to being only about 20,000 in 1520. And then if you kind of look ahead by the 1550s, there's only about 5,000 indigenous people in the territory that the Spanish call Panama, and some of those aren't even originally from there. They get imported from other areas. For the purposes of our story, it means that you have this whole region right here that suddenly went from having 250,000 people to not having anyone. And so when we begin to see Africans being brought forcibly through the transatlantic slave trade, and they decide to run away, there's a lot of places for them to go. And that's why in the history that I talk about, I'd like to go back to the Spanish conquest, because in a way, it's the Spanish conquest and the way that they dealt with and affected the indigenous population creates circumstances that then African peoples are able to exploit in order to secure their freedom, or at least to resist enslavement. So that brings us to the Africans and how they come to the Americas. This is like a chart that I would use to talk about the transatlantic slave trade across the 3 centuries that it is, or almost 4 centuries, that it is active. So it's absolutely, it's almost hard to fathom the number of people that we're talking about. We're talking about 12.5 million people who are put on ships on the coast of mostly the Atlantic coast, but as you can see, there's a couple streams coming from Eastern Africa. About 10.5 million end up arriving. And you can see the distribution. I like this map because the arrows kind of give you a rough sense of how big those flows are to different parts of the Americas. And what surprises my students when you talk about this is actually how few in the grand scheme of things actually come to kind of Anglo-British North America over that time period. I'm more than happy to, if you have questions about this, talk more about it. But what I want to jump ahead to, so here's a chart showing the growth of that trade, and you'll notice that it's kind of an exponential curve. So it's constantly growing over the centuries that it's active, pretty much until 1800, where things begin to change. But what's important for my story is actually the early period, the first 100 years of that trade. And in the first 100 years of that trade, which, yes, in the grand scheme of things, don't look like much, when you actually sort of take it just for that window of time, almost all of the Africans that are transported from Africa, roughly about 280,000, about 250,000 of those end up in Spanish possessions. Either they end up in Spain itself, or they end up where Spain is going in the Americas. And so that's the island of Hispaniola, the island of Cuba, Mexico, Panama, and then Colombia. And so during this period that I'm the sort of 1500s, from about 1515 to the sort of end point of my story, which is the 1580s, Panama is actually one of the largest recipients of Africans via the transatlantic slave trade, because Panama's role, what Panama becomes, is sort of what it is today. It's the gateway to the Pacific. And so when the Spanish conquer Panama, they use it as a base to get down to Peru and then to Chile. And once they conquer there, it becomes a thoroughfare. It becomes the way that you get from the Atlantic to the Pacific, particularly to Peru. And so you have lots of enslaved Africans that are being sold through these networks through Panama, and then they end up in places like Ecuador, and Peru, or Chile, or even Bolivia. And so there are a lot of Africans that are forced to move through Panama during this period, some of which would run away, but many of them will end up staying, because Panama is not a place that Spaniards are moving to settle. It really is a corridor. There's no canal yet, but that's what it is. There's a port on the Atlantic side, which is Nombre de Dios, the city that I mentioned, and then the city which we call Panama City, that the Spaniards just called Panama. Or even up in Central America, kind of on the Pacific side, like up towards Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica. All of those have to go across the isthmus. And then, most importantly, all of the stuff that the Spaniards are sending back to Spain has to make that reverse journey. And so, certainly the most valuable commodity going across is silver, and also to a lesser extent gold, being mined in South America, and then to get it back to Spain, it has to go to Panama and then back across the isthmus to Nombre de Dios, and then on ships back to Spain. And so in order to do anything in Panama, you need labor to do it. Spaniards aren't doing that labor. As I mentioned, they've decimated the indigenous population. So whereas in places like Mexico or Colombia or even Peru, most of that manual labor and even skilled labor is being done by indigenous people. In Panama, they turn to Africans. And because it's a port town, because it's connected to these transatlantic networks, it has access to the transatlantic slave trade. So these are pictures showing some of the activities that Africans are involved in. So here's mining for gold, here's smelting gold, here's diving for pearls. There's a set of islands off the Pacific coast of Panama called the Pearl Islands. And so there you have African as well as Native American divers being forced to dive for pearls. And this is showing you the canal before the canal. So this is a river called the Chagres River, which became the northern half or northern 3/4 of the Panama Canal. And even at this period that I'm talking about, they use boats to cover as much of that distance as they can. And who are the people that are crewing the boats? Enslaved Africans. But enslaved Africans are also doing all of the lumber cutting. They're doing all of the ranching, right? That's providing meat and leather. They're doing all of the construction, right? The vast majority of work that's being done in Panama is being done by Africans. This is some numbers. So this is from a set of documents. It's from a couple different documents that I've kind of collated together, but this is right around 1570. The Spanish population is about 1,500 people, and that's almost entirely split between those two port cities, with most of it living on the Pacific side in Panama City. Here, only on the Atlantic side, you only have about 150. But look at almost 4 times as many, or 5 times as many Africans as you do Spaniards. And then again, there's still a handful of, mostly to the west of Panama. But this gives you a pretty good idea of how many, who's actually doing. And you can see these are categories the Spanish official who's reporting this is talking about. So he says there's 102 Africans working in the orchards outside of the city, and there's 150 working on cattle ranches. There's 400 working the mule trains, which is the overland route that you can use to connect between those ports. 200 working as lumberjacks or in lumber mills, and 400 working as divers on the Pearl Islands. So again, I'm happy to answer questions on that. But what I want to get to is, other than the things that they're forced to do, what do Africans do? Well, one of the first things they do is try and escape slavery, right? And this happens anywhere you go, where the transatlantic slave trade is bringing people in captivity. So much so that it's happening even in that moment that I'm talking about. From Panama City, as I mentioned, Spaniards are going down to conquer into Ecuador. And so the king of Spain says, you can't take Africans on those expeditions because they're running away. They still do, and they continue to run away. Then by the 1530s, we have reports, more specific reports of marronage happening. So there's a town which actually by the 1570s doesn't even exist anymore. Let me go back to my conquest map here. So this town of Akla here, it's a mining town in the 1530s, and so there were a lot of enslaved Africans that are being sent there to pan for gold. This is an AI generated image because there's not good ones, but it gives you a sense of what it looks like to sort of dig into the hillside in order to search for gold dust and wash it. And so this is what the Spaniards are doing and what they're forcing Africans to do. They don't want to do that, and so they run away. And so that first town that I talked about actually is completely abandoned by this point. And so the enslaved Africans begin fleeing down the coast. In 1534, there's a suspected plot where some Spaniards have overheard Africans plotting a massive rebellion in Panama City. This happens a lot. There's a plot in Mexico City at almost the exact same time. These plots get discovered every now and again, and it's, from a historical point of view, very hard to tell whether or not these are real, or whether or not you're in a scenario where Spaniards know that they're outnumbered by enslaved people, and sort of envision a plot against them, a kind of psychosis response. But regardless of whether it was true or not, what comes out of the testimony, some of which was taken under torture, is that there's this plan to revolt and then to flee Panama City for Akla, or at least flee into that direction, into this part of the isthmus, which doesn't have any people, certainly not in the 1530s. The first named African leader that we hear about comes from 1549, and he's a man by the name of Felipe, who's a pearl diver working on these pearl islands, and he joins together with a bunch of other African divers and a bunch of indigenous Native American divers, and they steal some of the canoes that they use, and they take them across the ocean, this gap here, into this place called the Gulf of San Miguel, where they set up a community. They know that the Spanish are going to come after them. They defend it. They build a wall around it, a kind of palisade around it, and they're able to sort of live for a time. Eventually, there's another Spaniard who owns one of these pearl estates, who runs across a canoe of people from Felipe's community and then decides that he's going to go conquer them, which he does. He raises some men. He sort of forces his own indigenous and African divers to go with him, and they conquer this very early Maroon community on the shores of the Gulf of San Miguel. The Spaniard's name is Francisco Carreño. And I mention it because he'll come back into the story. But not surprisingly, the punishment for Felipe is that it's this very public, very symbolic execution in order to strike fear into other enslaved people so that they don't do what he did. It doesn't work. And in fact, over the next few years, it becomes clear to Spanish authorities that there are hundreds, if not sometimes thousands, at least that's what they claim, of these Africans who have fled from one of those two cities into this part of the isthmus. And what you can see here, these are these dots, that's how you get across the isthmus. So there's a mule train route over land this way, and then this is the water route that uses the river, and then the last third or so is also overland with mules. And in fact, by the early 1550s, they're getting reports that the Maroons are so numerous that they've actually sort of become a kingdom, and they have a king named Bayano. And so in the early 1550s, the governor of Panama sends out at least 4 major Spanish expeditions in order to defeat Bayano, and they all fail. The one that comes closest is actually led by the guy that had helped capture Felipe, this guy Francisco Carreño, who is actually able to make it where Bayano's settlement is, which I, based on the documents, think is somewhere around here, and negotiates with Bayano and basically offers him the terms that I mentioned at the beginning that come much later, which is that in order to stop, or in order to sort of deal with the very large number of Maroons in this moment, the Spanish would be willing to give those people who have fled freedom, allow them to settle a community here near the port of Nombre de Dios, if they would agree to basically become slave catchers. Part of their obligation would be to help prevent future enslaved Africans from doing what they had done. Ostensibly, there's an agreement. Bayano sort of says yes for his people. Carreño goes back to Nombre de Dios. There's some sort of arranged meeting, and it never happens. Bayano never comes back. It appears like the sort of tentative deal falls through. Jump ahead a year or two, and in 1556, the viceroy, so this is the top Spanish official who for this region is in Peru. So Peru kind of oversees all the way north to Panama, and then Mexico oversees most of Central America and farther north. So the viceroy of Peru, who oversees this area, in addition to Peru and Colombia and Venezuela and Chile, is getting off the boat here. He finds out about this maroon problem, and so he commissions this guy, Pedro de Ursua, who's a conquistador who had done stuff over in Venezuela and Colombia. He's, you know, a somewhat known commodity, and he says, I need you to go after Bayano, which he agrees to do, but it's hard to get Spanish troops to go on that expedition because they haven't been very successful. And so the viceroy actually kind of orders the prisons emptied. He basically has all the prisoners, he says, well, we'll commute your sentence if you join this expedition as soldiers. Ursua is certainly a pretty good military commander. He sort of organizes a combined seaborne and overland expedition, but he doesn't know the landscape, and most of the Spaniards don't know the landscape. This is not a place that they live or go to. Bayano's people know the landscape, and so the records are a lot of kind of guerrilla warfare, a lot of hit and run strikes that the Maroons make on the Spanish. But eventually we kind of get a repeat of what had happened just a few years before. Ursua and his men kind of reach the settlement of Bayano. They approach under flag of truce, and they have another negotiation. And again, it's the same kind of terms, that if you agree to sort of help us defend the city of Nombre de Dios, to help prevent other Africans from running away, we will grant you your freedom, and we will let you settle near the city. It appears that Bayano is willing to accept it, but Ursua has other ideas, that he sort of plans a deception. He tells his men the night before a kind of celebratory feast that the plan is to poison Bayano and his generals, his top commanders, and then to capture as many as they can. And that's what they do. They bring some the language is like poison or potion that kind of stupefies the person who drinks it, and they put it in the wine, and they slip it to Bayano and his generals. And when they're affected by this poison, they spring a trap, and they capture Bayano, they capture a number of his generals. But we know that a lot of that community escapes. They sort of splinter off into the jungles and forests that, again, the Spanish don't know. And it's also probably true that there's more than one community, there's more than one town or village, and the Spanish are only at the one that Bayano's at. So there's probably a lot of Maroons that they don't see that aren't even affected by this treachery. Bayano's story is somewhat interesting. I don't have any good official documents, but the lore, the kind of legend that pops up in other histories, is that he's actually sent to Peru to the viceroy. The viceroy is so impressed by him that rather than execute him like they had done with Felipe only a couple years before, they actually send him back to Spain, where he lives out his days in the town of Seville, which is basically the port of the Americas. It's where all the ships leave for the Americas, paid for by the royal treasury. That's the kind of lore. I'm not sure that it happened, but that's the lore that develops from this particular episode. Not surprisingly, especially because of the treachery of the Spanish, the fact that they don't know where all the Maroons are to begin with, the defeat of Bayano doesn't stop Maroons entering the isthmus. And we know that in the 1560s, we get just as many reports as more and more Africans continue to do what they do. In fact, there's a couple very sort of vivid reports. In 1569, there's a Maroon raid on Nombre de Dios, and we have the account of this person, Pedro González de Meseta, who is living over here. So he wasn't living in the town itself, but he was living over here on this kind of elevated hill overlooking the port, and the Maroons kind of come in from the east and they burn his house because he specifically says that he had settled there to help kind of provide watch both over the sea but also over the routes that Maroons used to get to Panama. And I think it's useful to point out right here that like one of the reasons why the Maroons are raiding Spanish cities is because having access to goods and materials that simply aren't available in the middle of the Isthmus of Panama. So most of the Africans that are coming from highly stratified, in many cases, wealthy societies in Atlantic Africa. And so, for example, they need steel. There's no steel to be mined in the Isthmus of Panama. So if they want to make weapons, like they're used to making weapons, they need to get steel. So they have to raid for steel. They can steal it from the Spanish. They also don't have access to, say, like cotton, to make cotton cloth, right? So to get clothes, they have to steal from the Spanish. So there's all sorts of manufactured goods that they're used to having access to because they're common even in their own societies back in Africa that simply aren't available where they're living in Panama. And so a lot of the raiding that the Maroons do is in order to get access to that stuff that they can't make themselves where they are in the isthmus, and often to free other enslaved people. So one of the things that comes up again and again is actually that over here, these little rivers just to the west of town, that's where the enslaved African women do the laundry of all of the Spanish residents of Nombre de Dios. So, whenever these Maroons raid Nombre de Dios, one of the places that they is the river where they can free enslaved African women who are doing the manual labor of Spanish households. I'm not going to go super into depth here. I'm more than happy to jump into it. But part of the story now begins to involve other Europeans. And the person that's most involved is this guy, Francis Drake. And what the text here says, and again, I can go into it if you have questions, is actually that the English, one of the first sets in the Atlantic, is try and get in on the transatlantic slave. First of these kind of English Elizabethan sea dogs is a guy by the name of John Hawkins. He actually makes 4 voyages, all of which are either to purchase or capture Africans in Africa or capture Portuguese slave ships in order to try and make colonies. One of the young men that sort of goes on at least a couple of the last of the voyages is a guy by the name of Francis Drake, who becomes much famous in the years to come. And so the point here is that Francis Drake has contact not just with the transatlantic slave trade, but with Africans themselves, both in Africa and those that are captive on the ships that he was on for John Hawkins that was trying to sell enslaved Africans to Spanish towns. There's also the French. The French are also in the Atlantic, and unlike the English, they're actually founding colonies during this period. They found at least 2 colonies up in North America, in Florida and South Carolina, and they actually have a much longer-lived, over a decade, colony in Brazil. And they're all off the coast of Panama. So we think that Drake was probably coming to Panama as early as 1570. In 1569, he was involved in this major naval battle up in Mexico. He escapes. Many English do not, and they're captured by the Spanish. But he escapes, and we think that he basically is kind of going back to England and coming into the Atlantic on a kind of cycle. For our story, the voyage of his that becomes part of the Maroon story happens in 1572. He wants to capture Nombre de Dios. And the reason why he wants to capture it is because the fleet that takes all of this stuff, well, either brings stuff from Spain and then takes stuff back, basically spends the winter here. And so it's got lots of storehouses. And so it's a place where, if you time it right, you can get lots of stuff. And so he wants to come and steal all of this stuff, including the gold and silver coming from Peru, that's going to be stored here. He's actually defeated and gravely wounded. And it's that wounding that actually leads him to escape down the coast of Panama. And around here, he actually encounters Maroons. And it's not quite clear how they first get into contact. It might be as simple as the English land and try and kind of, heal themselves, and just being on the coast, they run into kind of African Maroons that are in the region. But they make relatively quick alliance with the African Maroons, and after kind of healing up and preparing over almost 9 months, like 8-9 months, living with the Maroons, they plan a raid not to the city of Nombre de Dios, but on the roadway. There's a way station where travelers can spend the night, called the Venta de Chagres. And their plan is to time it so that they get to that place right as the bullion shipment of silver going back from the mines of Peru is crossing the isthmus. And so they want to ambush that shipment right here. It almost sounds like a Western story, right? Of like trying to stop the train, right? That's literally what's happening here. Unfortunately, a drunken Englishman alerts the Spanish, and they send the mule train back to Panama before they can raid it. So they go back to the coast, and at that point they meet up with a Frenchman, a guy by the name of Guillaume Letestu, and they wait a few more months, and again, they sort of have word, they have spies, right? The Maroons know who's traveling along that road, and so they basically wait for that shipment to be sent again. And the idea is to intercept it, kind of comes down out of the mountains into that town. They do intercept it, they do capture it, but the Spanish reprisal is a little bit faster than they thought, a little bit stronger than they expected. Letestu is mortally wounded. The English and the Maroons barely escape. They kind of bury the treasure as much as they can. They flee down the coast. After a few days, they're kind of able to, go back and collect some of it. But Drake sails away in the middle of 1573 and kind of makes a plan to come back. Now, the Spanish, quite rightly, are kind of pissed off, but they don't know what to do, and they kind of vacillate in terms of what they want to do. Almost immediately, they want to send out a military force, but then they're like, well, maybe we can negotiate again. And so they actually send out a priest, a Dominican friar, to try and negotiate. Well, that's really mixed messaging, right? The Maroons don't know what to do about that, so they kill the friar and they basically evade the military. Yeah, no, it's pretty brutal. Then, because of that, especially killing the friar, they decide to send out an even larger expedition, also unsuccessful. And then, by 1575, the King of Spain has heard about what's going on, and he says, look, maybe we could go back to that negotiation. And so they try and negotiate again, but again, there's a bunch of mixed messaging. The Maroons remember what Ursua did. The Maroons remember that they were not just tricked, that Ursua was treacherous. in his negotiation with Bayano. So they don't want to negotiate, and they basically avoid it. What that does is it brings us to another Englishman, actually someone who had been with Drake, and he comes back, right? In a sense, he's the guy that comes back that sort of fulfills this agreement, probably between Drake and the Maroons, about reuniting at some future date. So he comes back in 1576, and he basically he has the same general plan as Drake does, and the Maroons are totally fine with it, but instead of trying to deal with the overland route, they decide, why don't we just go into the Pacific? So they build boats along the rivers, or here in the Gulf of San Miguel. They sail out into the Pacific. They capture at least one merchantman who's coming from Peru up to Panama. And then they raid all of those estates on the Pearl Islands. And again, this is a place where the Maroons can free captives. And so the Maroons are very excited to free other Africans who are captive on those islands. The English are very happy to get pearls, which are some of the most prized and most valuable commodities of this particular moment in time. The problem is that, again, the Spanish respond faster than they expect. And so there's an expedition that's launched almost immediately. Basically, a couple Spaniards escape and they take a ship to Panama City, and very quickly the Spanish organize this expedition, led by a guy by the name of Pedro de Ortega Valencia. He follows them all the way up those rivers. He actually talks about seeing like detritus and stuff in the rivers, and that's how he knows that they're still going up rivers. He sees just stuff kind of floating down the river. And he eventually captures a number of English and Maroons who were kind of unloading the sort of the rear guard, as it were, of that expedition. And interestingly enough, he says, oh, I did it. I'm done. I captured some English, I captured some Maroons, I recovered a lot of the stuff that was stolen from the Pearl Islands. I'm going to go back to Spain, I'm going to tell the king what I did, and I'm going to get a reward. Now, that doesn't end the Spanish response. In fact, the Viceroy of Peru finds out about this, and he sends his own general, a guy by the name of Diego de Frias Trejo, up. And so over the course of 1577 and 1578, you have a couple different campaigns. You have some captains that are sent out along the Atlantic coast, basically to stop the English from getting on their ships and escaping. And so they actually do find where the English had hidden their ships, and it's pretty clear that they stopped the escape. So none of the English from this expedition ever make it home. And then you have this other general who basically comes in, follows the route that the first general had done, and engages in basically a scorched earth campaign through all of these river valleys that dot the center of the isthmus, which is exactly where all of the settlements that the Maroons were living in were located. And what's interesting about this is that he doesn't actually report capturing many Maroons. That it's clear that they flee. They leave their settlements, and they kind of break into smaller groups, and they go into hiding in the woods to evade them. And they appear to be successful at that. He calls it quits in October 1577. He captures the English Oxenham in October of 1577. And so we have some account of what the English were planning. This is actually an example of the type of documents that I'm using to tell this story. I mean, I'm happy to read it to you. It's not easy, but once you get used to it. This is an interesting excerpt from this period. The Maroons actually capture an enslaved African along the road, and this is actually his testimony. He doesn't want to be wrapped up with them. He actually chooses to run away from the Maroons and go back to the Spanish. And so this is one of the sources of information that's going on, and it's one of the ways that they discover that the Maroons basically kick the English out. So the English start wandering on their own, not knowing the land, and the Maroons kind of flee to places that they can hide at. That general that went away back to Spain gets a commission to go back, because the war's not over. But what's interesting is when he gets back in 1579, almost immediately after he arrives in the port of Nombre de Dios, some Maroons come to him, basically under flag of truce, saying, we want to negotiate. And so he goes to meet with them, in the Gulf of San Miguel, he in fact meets with a person called the King, King Domingo. Now, I don't actually think that he's a king in the way that Bayano was a king. I think it's a bit more of a confederacy, so he might be the first among many leaders of smaller different groups. But they negotiate for weeks. In fact, they just hang out. And so there's accounts that talk about the Maroons that accompany Domingo and the soldiers that accompany Ortega Valencia just playing games. In fact, they play games, kind of mock combat games. This is a Spanish kind of medieval, it's kind of like a joust situation called Juego de Cañas. They talk about doing that. They talk about going hunting together. And they kind of come to the same agreement that keeps popping up. But sort of like what happened with Francisco Carreño back in the 1550s, the Maroons agree to it, and they go back to their people and their communities that are hiding out in the forests, and they never come back. And so Ortega Valencia changes gears and then decides to hunt them. But as that main group of people kind of disappear, another group, which is the one that I talked about at the very beginning, who actually live kind of on the other side of the isthmus, come and are able to secure peace and create this first town of Santiago del Principe. And as a sign of their loyalty, begin to assist the Spanish in going after the Maroons that didn't accept this peace that had been negotiated with Ortega Valencia. What we get then is about a 2-year period where the Spanish are sending out expeditions. They're kind of trying to find these camps of Africans. They have information that they've gathered either from the handful of Maroons that they capture or from the Maroons that are now helping them. And so we have this is a list that was generated in about 1579, 1580, which is a list of the Maroons that are at large. And it's really valuable because it tells us how they're organized. And they're organized by African ethnicity. They're organized either because they come from similar groups or the same regions in Africa. And so and it tells us that they each have these leaders. So it talks about the leader and then the men and the women with that leader, right? The leader and the men and the women. The leader and the men and the women. Right, so we actually have a picture of what that organization looked like on the ground during this period. Now, it's a war of attrition on both sides, right? The Maroons have had to flee their towns that had fields and were sustainable, and so they're having to sort of make their way, kind of scavenging for food in the forest. But it's also incredibly costly for the Spanish. And as a result, then, by the end of 1581, both sides are kind of exhausted. And a Maroon leader by the name of Anton Mandinga kind of again approaches the Spanish, who at this point are more than happy to be done with it. And what's interesting is that because the Maroons are scattered, once they have this tentative agreement, they have to go find who they send to go find all of the Maroons that are scattered, other Maroons. And so this is a list of some expeditions that are documented, that there's a narrative of, we left Panama and we crossed to the Atlantic and we went across this river and this river and this river and this river in order to find all of these Maroons that are scattered all throughout this region, all the way going down to Colombia, in order to bring them back. And what happens is that you get another town. So this is the first town that was created in 1579, and all of the Maroons that are then sort of accept the peace that's done in 1582, get settled in this other town, Santa Cruz La Real, which is located near Panama City. And it's sort of set up in a similar way where they would have their own community, they would grow food and crops for themselves, but also to support the town, right? So both of these towns that are founded are meant to kind of be auxiliaries to the Spanish port, to provide food, to provide labor sometimes, to provide military defense in case the English or the French come back. And sure enough, I know we're kind of getting at time, but there is an epilogue to this which involves Drake again, and gives us some windows into what these Maroons are doing in these free towns that they've secured. One of the biggest things that they're doing is that they help move the port. So the Spanish don't like the port of Nombre de Dios, which is this one. It's very shallow, it's not very defendable, these hills are not very tall. So they want a new port, and they choose the port of Portobello, which is actually where that first group of Maroons had been living before they before they got a peace agreement, and so they actually get to move home. And because it's home, they know how to find roadways, because the Spanish need a road from this new port back to Panama, and so they help do that. Right around the time that the port is officially moved, two things happen. One, the English come back, and Francis Drake wants to capture the whole colony. He comes back with a very large fleet. It appears the plan is to try and capture all of Panama, to literally take over the isthmus from the Spanish. The Spanish are tired of having these two communities of former Maroons, and they actually order them both to be consolidated on the Atlantic side. So there's an idea, even before these English arrive, that the Spanish want all of the Maroons that they've given freedom to be in one town, and the town that they want is the one on the Atlantic. Probably precisely for what's happening, because it's the one that's more likely to be attacked by other European powers. The English invasion goes horribly. The Spanish are well aware that it's coming. They defend it. The Maroons defend it. The Maroons of Santiago del Principe help defend the town of Nombre de Dios, and the ones of Santa Cruz la Real actually serve as a rear guard, kind of defending closer to Panama. They defeat the English. Drake dies. He ends up, I think, dying of dysentery. Here's a picture of him being buried at sea, kind of off the coast of Portobello. The town, the now single town, exists here outside of Portobello for a number of years. We know that in 1607, the leader of this town, a guy by the name of Don Mazambique, is still alive. He's got to be in his 80s or his 90s. It continues to exist until at least through the 1620s. We still hear about it. But there's some point, probably from the 1620s on, that it kind of disappears. And my suspicion is that a lot of the residents of that town basically just gravitated to the port, that there were more opportunities there. The benefits of having their own town kind of over here weren't as much as the benefits as being part of the broader port, and so they moved and they went there. And certainly today, Portobello and most of this part of Panama is predominantly Afro-descended, and so certainly today in Portobello there are people that are descended from the Maroons of my story. But I'll end it there so we have time for questions. And yeah, I'm more than happy to pick up on any of the threads that I could only give a little bit of coverage to.
All right, and real quick, if anyone has any questions, just please raise your hand and I will bring the microphone around for you.
Really close.
Yeah, really close.
I saw two words up there that I didn't know.
Okay.
First one was Darien.
Darien, yeah, that's the first Spanish settlement that's all the way down the coast, kind of by Colombia. So you might hear it today, like right now it's the Darien Gap. There's no road. It's the one part of the Trans-American Highway where there is no road because it is so jungly, and it's also a place of massive human smuggling because of that. So there are a lot of like Venezuelans that are trying to escape the trouble in Venezuela, that are trying to get up, that are going through that region. So if you see it today, but it's the same place. Yeah.
Maybe it was African American, they gave testimony, and he said after his name.
Criollo, I think it was?
Yeah, my Spanish is rusty.
Yeah. That's a good question. So often in these names, what's very interesting is that almost all of the Africans that are listed by name have been given Christian names, and it's quite likely that many of them are actually practicing Christianity that they've integrated into their African belief systems. There's a whole, even in Africa, we see something called African Christianity. But the last name is often the way that we can tell where they're from or what ethnic group they're a part. So for example, this group here, this is Martin Bran, here's Manuel Bagnol, Over here we have Diego Biafara. The one that I was talking about there that gave his testimony, he doesn't have an African ethnonym because he was born in the Americas. And sometimes they do, there are examples of the children who are born in the Americas that still get the name often associated with their parents, but criollo just means born in the Americas. And eventually, like in Latin American history, it ends up being appropriated by Spaniards to mean like, yeah, Creole. I mean, it's the Spanish version of Creole.
Was there any assistance with the indigenous people and slaves as far as working?
That's a great question, and that's actually how I found this in the first place. So one of the things that I found in my dissertation, which is actually on Mexico, is that there's a lot of connections that are forged between people of African descent, whether they're African or Creoles, or even a mixed African ancestry, and indigenous people. So I was looking for that when I ran across the documents for this. And in fact, there are some very good examples. So in the case of Bayano, the account that we have of his town actually talks about an indigenous community being located right next door. And it gives it a name, which is actually really unique. It's called the Caricua. And we don't know much about the language of the Cueva people of Panama, but it definitely sounds like a name that could be Cueva. So I think that there's some truth to that. And in the case of this story, the kind of later story, when all of those expeditions go out to bring back the Maroons in order to sort of create that second town, I'll get there eventually, this map, there's at least 100 indigenous brought back. And when we have the documents for the founding of this town, Santa Cruz La Real, and it literally says, the Spanish say, and we settled the Indios, right, the indigenous people, right next door because they wanted to stay near the Maroons. So yes, there's not many, but there are very clear, relatively amicable relations between the Maroons and the indigenous people that they encountered there. I will point out, if anyone could read the small print, the indigenous history of this region is very interesting. Down here, this is Darien, this is the region of Darien right here. By the 1570s and 80s, there appears to be a migration happening of indigenous peoples who, in the beginning of the 1500s, were well into Colombia, and they've pushed up into this space because it is so uninhabited. And the Maroons talk about them as being indios de guerra, right? Warlike Native Americans. And it appears that that migration has actually hemmed in the space that Maroons choose to live in. Because unlike the communities that I just talked about, they don't get along. And it's clear that that group continues to migrate and very possibly becomes the Guna people of Panama today, that now actually have a very large autonomous, I don't want to say reservation because that's not the term, but they have an autonomous community that covers much of the region that we're showing here is called Guna Yala. And it could be that this is the earliest record of that migration that brings them there.
When was slavery abolished in that area?
Not till after independence. Yeah, so this is hundreds of years later. So Panama becomes independent in the 1520s, going with Colombia, and it's part of Colombia for a long time until during the Spanish-American War and whatnot. After that, we go in and take the Canal Zone for ourselves for a time. Yeah. So it's not until the early 1800s that it's abolished. Yeah. And in the Spanish Empire, it's not abolished fully until the 1870s in Cuba, when it's abolished in Cuba. Yep.
When you started out, you said there were 22 million Africans embarked to come over here, but only 10 million made it?
12.5 million.
Oh.
Yeah. And some of those are estimates. And the other thing that I'll say about the numbers for Africans, and it's something that we don't necessarily get a lot when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade today, but at the time, the Spanish and the Portuguese who were involved in it knew it, is that the networks that produced those captives stretch deep, deep, deep into the interior of Africa. And so those numbers, if you're talking about the number that are sort of caught up in the wars that produce those captives and maybe even die before they reach the coast where they could be sold. Right, so like the total number of victims of the process that creates the transatlantic slave trade, that number is probably closer to 15 or 18 million, right? Because we're talking about people that are involved in wars all into the interior of Africa. And then some of them die in those wars, some of them die on the way to the coast, a whole lot die on the coast before we even get to that number. You had one more question.
This is totally off topic, but you mentioned that the Chagres, Rio Chagres is the northern part of the Panama Canal.
Yes.
Is that why it goes from west to east? I've heard that it runs from west to east.
Runs. Well, it has a system of locks. And actually, the Panama Canal, I love historical archaeologists, and there's not enough people that are doing what I would call maroon archaeology. But part of there's two things that happen because of the canal and because of modernization in Panama. One, so they dam up the Chagres River, and there's actually a big lake right here called Lake Gaitun. So there's probably tons of indigenous and African maroon sites that are now at the bottom of Lake Gaitun. And then there's a series of locks to get up to. So I don't know if it runs from west to east, because it goes from here, pretty much here to here, and there's locks on both sides to get it up and then down. So, but the other thing is that they put a hydroelectric dam. This river here that I call the Rio Chepo is now the Rio Bayano, named after Bayano, and they flooded the upper reaches of this watershed. So this area right here, which could very well have amazing archaeological finds of these African communities, is now the bottom of a lake. I mean, it's providing hydroelectric power, so that is a good thing for Panama, but from the point of view of preserving or finding that history, it's very hard.
Any last questions? If not, then please give a round of applause for Professor Schwaller.
Thank you for coming.
And then a little bit of last minute announcements. So once again, thank you, Professor Schwaller, and thank you everyone for coming out to the museum this afternoon. Remember, next month's Senior Wednesday will be November 6th, and we also have Coffee with the Curator on October 17th, when Dr. Matthew Holland from Wichita State will be coming to give a talk titled Digital Archaeology in the Biblical World. Hope to see you all there.
My wife is